Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. We have a Zoom link, so good evening, good morning to anyone that's actually not in the Eastern, time zone. And welcome to the second installment of the University Seminar Series, Intersectional Masculinities. And tonight we have What Heals Chicano Masculinity, presented by the great Francisco Velarte. My name is Dr. Dwayne Quasey Wright. I'm an assistant professor of higher education administration at the Graduate School of Education and Human Development here. And I have the honor of sort of just laying the groundwork for you tonight. The inception of this series is born of intersections. Both the concepts of intersectionality, most famously taught by law professor Kimberly Crenshaw, but really the birth child of a Black lesbian socialist feminist movement known as the Combahee River Collective. Of course, the Combahee River, named after the occupational hazard that Harriet Tubman actually went through, and was the only Black female-led military occupation that freed slaves. And I wanted to just sort of start that way as we are in the last week of Black History Month. Intersectional masculinities sort of seeks to answer three primary questions. The questions are on the back of the speaker bio if you sort of wish to engage. But I think it would be a bit naive, protect, hesitant, or maybe living in a bubble if we didn't acknowledge that we are living in a critical moment. So one thing that I would like this conversation, the knowledge that Professor Galate is here to install on you, is to just simply understand that what we are here engaging in right now is an act of resistance. That there are people right now in the United States trying to erase the fact that we can even have this conversation, trying to erase patriarchal people, and trying to, quite frankly, ruin lives. And we can't all take up arms. We don't all have shows on MSNBC. But as researchers, what we do have is our brains and our voices. So what the four of us, myself, Professor Goulart, James McCaster, and Desmond Goss, really want to do to you is just allow you to enjoy this moment. Enjoy it, because we really don't know how much longer it will last. But rather than think of this pessimistically, I'm a lawyer, I tend to do it. Let's think of this optimistically. Enjoy it, because I still believe this is the future. Regardless of what's happening 6 blocks away, I look at the students in this room. I look at the students that inspired the seminar. I look at the students that Professor Galarte has in New Mexico, and that we have at GW, and you still inspire us to a future that is always brighter than this temporary darkness we're in. And with that, I have the pleasure of introducing my friend, Manuel Cuellar, which is going to take you through the rest of the event. Manuel Ricardo Cuellar is an associate professor of Latin American and Latinx studies at the George Washington University. His primary research engages in questions of performance, especially those that concern dance, ingenuity, Afro-Mestizo, imaginaries in Mexico, and combining ethnographic fieldwork, architectural research, and studies of contemporary as well as classic Najiro, Mexico's most widely spoken and written indigenous language. Professor Cuellar's strong background in Mexican traditional dance has led him to explore dance roles in Mexican nationality, indigeneity, and queerness, both in Mexico and here in the United States. He's the author of the great book, Choreographing Mexico, and if you get a chance, you should pick that up. And the winner of the 2023 Del Toro Beno First Book Award from the Dance Studios Association. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my friend, Manuel Cuellar. Manuel, thank you for today.
Buenas tardes. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Um, I would like to also thank our co-sponsors, the Cisneros Hispanic Leadership Institute, for collaborating with us, as well as the CCA Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, the Graduate School of Education and Human Development, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program, the Department of Sociology, our own Department of Romance, German, and Slavic Studies, and the Department of English, as well as the C Commission for the Arts and Humanities. It is indeed un honor I'm honored to introduce Francisco Galarte, who's an associate professor of American Studies and Women and Gender and Sexuality Studies and director of the Feminist Research Institute at the University of New Mexico. He was born and raised in Brawley, California, in the Imperial Valley along the US-Mexico border. He identifies strongly as a transfronterizo, meaning the borderlands inform his creative and scholarly projects. His most recent articles have appeared in publications including Aztlán, Journal of Chicano Studies, Chicana Latina Studies Journal, and TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly. He holds a PhD in Educational Policy Studies with a minor in Latina and Latino Studies from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Before arriving at the University of New Mexico, he was an assistant professor of gender and women's studies at the University of Arizona, where he was a member of the Transgender Studies Research Cluster, a collective of faculty that is the first of its kind in the world to bring together scholars in transgender studies from various disciplinary backgrounds to foster cross-collaboration in the form of research, writing, and teaching. He has been involved with the TSQ Transgender Studies Quarterly since the journal's inception in 2011. He served as a fashion editor from 2012 to 2018, and has served as co-general executive director since 2018. Transgender Studies Quarterly is published by Duke University Press and is the only journal in transgender studies. Galarte's research brings transgender studies, Chicanics and Latinx studies, and queer studies into critical dialogue. In doing so, he expands these academic fields, transforms the central issues of inquiry, and contributes to ongoing conversations related to the study of race, gender, and sexuality. His primary scholarly agenda is to examine the relationship between systems of racial formation and the lived experiences and cultural representations of racialized transgender subjects. His first book, Brown Transfigurations, Rethinking Race, Gender, and Sexuality in Chicana's Latinx Studies, published by the University of Texas Press in 2021, was the inaugural book for the Latinx The Future Is Now book series edited by Nicole Guidotti Hernandez and Lorgia Garcia Peña. The book explores how transgender analytics intervene or fail to intervene in the current breeding practices that exist in Chicana and Chicano studies for making sense of processes of racialization, gendered violence, queer sexualities, masculinities, and femininities. Brown Transfigurations was awarded the Alan Bray Memorial Book Prize by the MLA GLQ Caucus in 2022, the John Leo and Dana Heller Award by the Popular Culture Association, also in 2022, and the Book of the Year Award by the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education, also in 2022. He has been working on a second book project tentatively entitled Dolor's Gender, the problem of Chicanics, Latinx, femininities, and masculinities, and it's my understanding that this is the first iteration of this talk that will be part of his meeting. Welcome, Francisco, bienvenido.
Thank you so much, everybody, for being here, making the time. Thank you to everyone who made this lecture possible, from booking the flights to taking care of Zoom, to checking people in. Thank you, everybody. I'm very grateful for your labor and your time. And I'm excited to share with you, if I can get my iPad to open, this talk, which is making its debut here today. So today I'm going to talk about designer Willy Chavarria. I'm going to show, by the time we're finished, we'll have watched the entire show that just occurred on January 25th. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to go ahead and get into the talk, if that's okay. So Chicano fashion designer Willy Chavarria recently declared, "I am the new Chicano Ralph Lauren, and my clothes are for everybody." Chavarria's Chicano-inspired clothing has garnered him the honor of CFDA Menswear Designer of the Year for 2 years, in 2023 and 2024. In this talk, I discussed Chavaria's first shoe design, the Jalisco, produced in partnership with iconic American shoemaker Allen Edmonds. The study focuses on Chavaria's take on the dressy derby shoe and the choice of modifying the traditional shoe design by adding a 54 millimeter Cuban heel. Chavaria imagines the silhouette as the quote, new unformal shoe that will transcend seasons, occasions, and gender boundaries. Through a close reading of the silhouette of the shoe, the accompanying ad campaign, and the sonics and aesthetics of his recent fashion show, Tarantula, in 2025, I argue that Chavaria's Chicano-inspired designs fashion new forms of masculinity informed by the stylized and highly visible refusal of Pachuco youth. Moreover, I argue that Chavaria's designs do more than transcend gender boundaries. Instead, his work heals masculinity. By invoking the lineage of Pachuca and Pachuco, Campesino and Homeboy fashions in these designs, and highlighting the excesses of Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx stylistic flamboyance, Chavaria's garments offer a new form of racialized, class, and gendered Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx, Chicane style. The figuration of these archetypes opens discussions within Chicana Chicano style politics, as well as new possibilities for Chicana Chicano subjects to enact a politics of style that is untethered from regressive heteronormative and heteropatriarchal underpinnings of the traditional masculine archetypes within Chicano realist aesthetics. In other words, Chavaria's heels, and by extension his style, keep toxic masculinities at bay and open new worlds where the wearer and viewer can explore and feel the vicissitudes of the pleasures within unbounded brown masculinities. In August 2024, Chavaria's team disseminated press releases announcing his collaboration with iconic American shoemaker Allen Edmonds. The partnership is Chavaria's new shoe, the Jalisco, and it is described by press releases in the following manner, quote, the Jalisco is a split-toe derby Oxford with a Cuban heel. It challenges the conventional norms of dress shoes. Chavaria has coined it the unformal shoe, a design that is intended to be worn across different seasons, occasions, and by people of all genders. The attention to detail, from the contoured 54 millimeter heel to the gold foil WC initials stamped on each shoe, reflects Chavaria's precision and dedication to creating a product that is both bold and timeless. Chavaria's collaboration with Allen Edmonds is about creating a new shoe and merging the past with the present. By drawing from archival lasts and combining them with modern design elements, Chavaria and the artisans at Allen Edmonds have crafted a shoe that respects tradition while pushing forward into new territories of style. Willie Chavaria's brand is known for its mission to uplift the underrepresented through art and design with collections that blend emotional depth and political themes. His work often draws inspiration from his Mexican-American heritage and the beauty found in urban landscapes, creating pieces that resonate on a deeply human level. This collaboration with Allen Edmonds aligns with Chavaria's ethos as it brings together his unique perspective with the craftsmanship of a legendary American brand. So the shoe is unisex, redefines luxury, and is rooted in American tradition that a brand like Allen Edmonds represents. The company was established in Belgium, Wisconsin in 1922 by Albert W. Allen as Allen Spiegel Shoe Company. It is one of the few companies that maintain manufacturing in the United States. The company gained much of its following after providing shoes to the US Army and Navy during World War II. As of 2022, Allen Edmonds employs, sorry, just hold on. Employs 135 craftspeople, many of which are second and third generation makers. Each shoe goes through a 212-step process and will see up to 60 different craftspeople before the shoe is completed. The Jalisco then blends Chavaria's commitment to Chicano-inspired designs with traditional American manufacturing processes. At this point, focusing on the shoe's aesthetics becomes essential. The shoe was made on the Allen Edmonds archival last 2719. And if you don't know what a last is basically the pattern from which the bottom of the shoe is made. So it's a split toe derby. A split toe derby is the type of derby shoe with the seam running down the front, as you can see. And an apron is sewn on top, forming the ridge running along the top. Shoemakers have described the purpose of the split toe was originally to achieve better waterproof qualities. One version of the story of how the model of the shoe was born says that the English created the model out of the need for shoes made for workers who during the 19th and early 20th centuries built large infrastructure projects such as channels, railways, and the like. These were navigational engineers with the nickname navvies. So it goes, when the channels were dug, there was often a wet field in which they worked. And the shoes that resisted water were required. In this history of the split-toe derby, we learn that the shoe style has its history in labor. So while Chavaria's rendering is sleek and chic, historically the shoe was born out of a utilitarian need. As you can see, the visible stitching at the shoe's toe, apron, and rear sets the shoe apart visually. The visibility of the seams is notable. The stitching indexes where parts of the shoe patterns come together, but also highlight the craftsmanship and skill of the craftsperson's stitching abilities. The visibility of the stitch marks the identifiability of the shoe. The other significant marker that sets Chavaria's shoe apart from different models of split-toe derbies is the 54mm Cuban heel. A 54mm Cuban heel is just over 2 inches. So while these are nowhere near close to a 5-inch stiletto heel, Chavaria's shoe is a heel nonetheless. So allow me, if I may, give you a brief history of men in heels. So the use of high-heeled shoes by men dates back to the 10th century when the Persian cavalry used them to keep their boots in their stirrups, which gave them the needed stability to shoot their bows and arrows. By the 17th century, 1-inch heels were the norm for Persian riders on and off their horses. At the time, owning a horse was a symbol of wealth. Therefore, heeled shoes came to symbolize money and power. By the end of the 17th century, Persian soldiers had come in contact with foreign leaders in Russia, Germany, and Spain. Persian styles became fashionable, leading European aristocrats to adopt heels as a symbol of virility and military prowess. In the 17th century, male fashion emphasized the legs with garments and high heels to highlight men's shapely calves and thighs. Louis XIV was perhaps the most famous wearer of heels in history. Under Louis's rule, the higher and better the heel, the more powerful the wearer. In 1670, he passed an edict stating that only nobility could wear heels, and according to historians, only those who were in Louis's favor were allowed to wear red heels. So if we think about red bottom shoes, it's kind of where we're getting that lineage to. So historians believe that the red heel was symbolic. It showed that its wearer was rich enough not to dirty his shoes, and that he was powerful enough to crush his enemies underfoot. In the 18th century, shoes and fashion more generally became increasingly gendered. For example, women's shoes became narrower and more ornamental, with higher heels, whereas men's shoes became broader and sturdier. By 1730, men had stopped wearing heels as a reaction to their perceived feminization. The French Revolution in 1789 put a definitive end to the aristocratic usage of male heels. However, there are still specific historical examples in which wearing male heels was acceptable. A very American example is the cowboy boot, a modern update of the 10th century Persian cavalry heel. The angled rounded heel on a cowboy boot is also a Cuban heel, which references the Latinx heritage, and that flamenco and Latin ballroom dancers wear shoes with a Cuban heel. I would also add that shoes worn in select regions of Mexican folklorico wear boots or botines with Cuban heels. Perhaps the most famous 20th century wearers of Cuban heels are the Beatles, popularized the Cuban heel in the 1960s and 70s. That's what we see in this image here. Beetle boots were a variant of the Chelsea boots, tight-fitting, ankle-high boots with a sharp point toe and Cuban heels. Other popular icons remembered for wearing heeled shoes include David Bowie, Motley Crue, and Prince. Contemporarily, men wearing heels has shifted from symbolizing power, wealth, and masculinity to pushing the boundaries of binary gender norms. Chavaria's shoe makes its intervention in that the shoe intended to be genderless very much highlights the ability of the high heel to symbolize masculinity. I argue that Chavaria's Jalisco transforms masculinity's symbolic nodding into maleness. To further understand this, it becomes crucial to understand the bodily transformation incurred when wearing a high heel. So in 1901, British physician and suffragist Dr. Ethel M. Williams wrote about the high heel in her article, Common Deformities of the Feet. So in 1901, she writes, the damage done by the ill-shaped sole is increased by the artificial heel, since the foot placed on an inclined plane gradually slips further into the toe of the shoe and is molded to its shape. But besides contributing to the production of halos valgus, or bunions, and I'm putting the bunions there so we all know what halos valgus is. The high heel has developed a quite abnormal method of walking. Williams elaborates on this abnormal method of walking. She writes, in natural walking, the heel alone is first planted on the ground. The body swings forward and the front part of the foot comes in contact with the ground, while the heel is lifted by the contraction of the calf muscles, followed by the front part of the foot. In walking with a high heel, the foot is swung forward with the calf muscles contracted, the ankle extended, and the toes lowered and pointed, so that the front part of the foot is first planted on the ground, or at best, this reaches the ground contemporaneously with the heel. Thus, the whole action of walking is altered. Therefore, the high heel is more than just its aesthetics. It transforms the movement of the wearer's body. In thinking through how to write about the symbolic power of Chavaria's shoe, I begin to think about the kinds of bodily movements enabled by the high heel, how it might transform the wearer's relationship to their body and physical movements, and of course, how these movements transform how we might perceive Chavaria's clothing as it moves on the wearer walking down the runway. So I want you to watch, as I keep going with the talk, this slow motion kind of version of this of one of the models walking down the runway. So as I mentioned earlier, and we'll discuss in detail later in this talk, critics describe Chavaria's fashions as drawing from his Mexican-American heritage, specifically Pachuca, Pachuco, Cholo, and Campesino archetypes. Chavaria's Jalisco is rooted in Pachuco aesthetics, as zoot suiters often wore double or triple soled shoes, though not a proper heel. A double or triple soled shoe elevates the wearer's height, so perhaps we might think of Chavaria's updating of men's formal shoes as a nod to this 1940s trend among Mexican-American youth. Although a double or triple soled shoe might be more like a platform shoe, the shoes enabled the wearers to engage in 1940s dance culture. The shoes were part of the wearer's manera de ser, or swagger. Again, I'm interested in the relation between the body, movement, and fashion. The relation between aesthetics, bodily experience, and affect is critical for unpacking. As noted by your various themes, Manuel Cuellar, it, quote, demands we become attuned to the ways aesthetics and bodily experience enables the rehearsal and performances of social possibilities, end quote. In this case, what is at stake are the social possibilities within non-normative forms of masculinity, specifically a racialized masculinity that has been at times both valorized and devalued. In this case, masculinity in motion invites an analysis that illuminates the critical role of moving bodies in the formation and distribution of structures of Chicano nationalism, and how transformative corporeal practices shape and reshape these bodies. While Manuel Cuellar's work focuses specifically on dance as its objective of movement, I find his discussion of kinesthesia particularly productive for analyzing the movements of masculinity I gestured to here. Cuellar understands, quote, kinesthesia is the body's awareness of its movement and position. It is an ability to sense, literally through various sensory organs, but it also takes it to mean to make sense. Recognizing that we can register meaning from our awareness of movement and position invites us to consider how the body is implicated in meaning-making practices. Kinesthesia as a meaning-making paradigm then exemplifies an embodied understanding of the world. However, the ability to make sense out of movement and position necessarily implicates one's relation to the other, end quote. Furthermore, Cuellar asks us to ponder what kinds of interactions do we have with others through movement? How are we affected by other bodies in motion? Tabaria's healed inaugurate a new form of Chicana, Chicano, Chicanex, Chicane, masculine sense, putting new sets of relationships in motion to make sense of Chicana, Chicano, Chicanex, Chicane masculinity. Oh. So here I turn to an image of the ad campaign for the shoe. As you can see in the frame, we see the shoes on the wearer whose gender is not revealed. Central to the frame are the silhouettes of the shoes. Also in the frame is a Chicano Latino hypermasculine figure presented within the signs of a homeboy aesthetic, presumably on all fours in a crouched position of submission to the wearer of the shoes who is seated, making eye contact and on the precipice of making oral contact with the shoes. This erotic scene of desire is choreographed so that the inhuman object, the shoe, figures as the dominant phallic subject in the photo. Desire then circulates between the submissive subject, or the wearer of the shoes, and the shoes themselves. The photograph is framed. The photograph is framed so that the consummation of desire hinges on highlighting the heel in the shoe's profile. The representation of the homeboy in the scene of submission and desire provokes some key questions about Chicano masculinity. What is the relational nature of Chicano masculinity? The composition of the photo invites us to draw our attention to the product, the shoe. Still, it also suggests something else about the form of Chicano masculinity that is legible in the photo. What does it mean for Chicano masculinity to be in submission in a context that is not one where the submission is at the hands of racist, sexist, and patriarchal forces or institutions? Chavarria positions the inhuman object in relation to Chicano masculinity and sets Chicano masculinity in motion through a submissive pose that visually does not disrupt the masculine subject's homeboy aesthetic. Instead, it seduces. It lures us to ponder how corporeal practices and arrangements reveal how masculinities are not determined in advance, and indeed are and can be improvised. The heel then figures centrally in illuminating the relational nature of Chicana, Chicano, Chicanex, Chicane masculinity. In Chavarria's designs, fashion becomes a generative archival site, where garments like a suit, shoes, and ornamentation like a rosary, in concert with with the movement of the body, becomes forms of sense making, orienting the wearer and the viewer towards exploring Willy Chavarria's world. Here I pivot towards immersing us into Chavarria's world making by engaging in an abbreviated discussion of his most recent fashion show, his Paris Fashion Week debut the Paris Fashion Week debut of his 2025 autumn-winter collection entitled Tarantula. I'm offering provisional claims, so I'm still kind of thinking through these things, and observations on the show, as the show and collection just debuted on January 24th, 2025. So I've been thinking with this for about a month. So that's a short amount of time for me as a thinker. So I'm gonna look for you all to kind of help me think through things as I get through the talk here. So the show was Chavarria's 10th fashion show, and he chose the Episcopalian American Church in Paris as the location for his show after hearing Bishop Marianne Edgar Budd and her now infamous sermon directed at President Trump at the inauguration service. The church's narthex was adorned with lush red flora, fauna, and candlelight for the runway backdrop. So here I'm going to go ahead and show the first part. I've divided the show into 3 parts, so we're going to watch what I call part 1 of the show.
Before the feeling for time, the crashing waves of wine. Why? Dissipating, honey. Hey, honey. Dissipating, honey. Ah, ah, and God. Alice fire, are you fire? Are you? Are you? So the way. Are you? Are you?
So the show is opened by trans Latina singer and artist Dorian Wood, singing their song Honey, accompanied by three cellists, and wearing a scarlet gown while holding a rosary. Sonically, the composition of this version of Wood's song "Honey" resembles the song "Tarantula" by the 1980s indie avant-garde music collective The Mortal Coil. Chavarria explained the song to Forbes reporter Roxanne Robinson. He says, "It's a song about a soft and beautiful creature doing its own thing on the planet, minding its business, and we villainize it. We make it a monster, but it is quite gentle. Until it is messed with, then it bites," end quote. However, the song Chavarria chose from Wood's works exposes the possibility of what may come when villainized subjects bite. Wood's song contains the following refrains: "Here for the end, the healing mark of time, the crashing waves of white indifference, dissipating, honey, dissipating, honey, dissipating, honey, gone and gone. Who's the palace fire? Are you the palace fire? Are you the way?" In Wood's free verse lyrics, quote, "Here for the end and healing mark of time," end quote, gestures to a Munosian inspired sense of queer time, where the end of and healing mark of time invites a new beginning, or the not yet here of queerness. The not yet here is in fact our here and now, which necessitates and demands the waning of whiteness. In contrast to the refrain honey, indexes the inauguration of the ascendance of brown abundance. The palace fire must come That the palace fire must come as a provocation to burn down racist structures, policies, and affects so that the end and healing mark of time may come. The way then that the tarantula or brown subject in Wood's honey bites is through its brown abundance and opulence, which we experience through Wood's voice. A world of brown abundance necessitates the obliteration of racist, sexist, nativist, and homophobic structures, policies, and affects. The first part of Chavarria's collection highlights the lavishness of brownness, which contrasts with the dolorous sounds of Wood's voice as he employs the refrain, "Are you?" So apart from the opening look, this first part of the show features much more traditional and as subdued as Chavarria can get, that is, looks that highlights Chavarria's commitments to styles rooted in tropes of the Chicana aesthetic, what I identify as we see here, the Pachuca, the campesino laborer, and the homeboy aesthetics. And some of you might have guessed that that's Osuna right there in the middle. So he had quite a cast of people that walked in his show as well. And J Balvin is in there too. We'll talk about him in a minute. So by and large, Chavaria stays true to West Coast Pachuco interpretations of the zoot suit by featuring subdued colors, plaids, and traditional zoot silhouettes. However, oh, no, give me 1 second. Okay, so however, he features a garnet red crushed velvet suit, or his unisex chuco suit, as his first look, which douses the catwalk as Wood offers his dolorous rendition of Honey. The suit features a red and black color scheme. Not the slide. Hold on. I spent a lot of time on my deck, so I'm really really want to make sure you get the full experience here. Okay, I don't know what's going on. We'll see that. Okay, so the suit features a red and black color scheme, which evokes the Nahuatl term Intilili Intlipalpali, or the red and black ink painted on codices. According to Gloria Anzaldúa, red and black symbolize writing and wisdom. Red and black have been associated with a range of affects, such as love, joy, fear, and anger. These affects are also mirrored in Wood's voice and lyrics during the show. In addition, Chavarria's use of color here and throughout the show pushes back against post-World War II, the post-World War II notion that, quote, the taste for bright colors and big styling was defined as a racial disposition, as an aspect of essentialist racial characteristics, unquote. Through Chavarria's look, and by look, I include the styling, so the hair, the makeup, and the accessories, and the embodied movement of the model wearing the suit. He is documenting writing the historical affects imbued within brown fashion, which includes the dolorous effects of racism. In the show's opening look, the model is covered in garnet crushed red velvet that moves sensuously as the model walks down the catwalk in his Jalisco heels. His tattooed hand clutching a rosary, a velvet rose on his lapel, and a large wide-brimmed cowboy hat with a rosary. The structured shoulder in the silhouette or cut of the suit indexes the zoot suit, which resonates with not just Chicanos, but also African Americans, Filipino Americans, and Japanese Americans. Elizabeth Escobar offers a nice, Escobedo offers a nice description of the sartorial expression of the zoot suit. So the zoot suit or drapes, as the boys sport like to call the outfit, can generally be described as an exercise in excess, a composition in conspicuous consumption. It's consisted of the very baggy pants that fit very high on the waist, in most extreme cases all the way to the armpits, deep pleats and extremely narrow cuffs. The coat had wide lapels and shoulder pads that resembled epaulets and was sometimes so long it reached the knees. Accessories to the zoot suit included a wide brimmed pancake hat, long watch chains, and thick soled shoes. The female equivalent to zoot suiters, the cholitas, also wore distinctive, if not outlandish, clothes. Their outfits consisted of either flared or tight short skirts, tight sweaters, and distinct styles of earrings and makeup. The zoot suit changes ordinary apparel into art and elicits strong feelings of aggression, nihilism, and vitality and desire. According to Luis Alvarez, some observers also considered male zoot suiters as overly feminine for their constant attention to dress, hairstyle, and appearance, making them as a gendered other. He adds, quote, characterized as pleasure seekers obsessed with leisure, zoot suiters were a foil to hardworking, responsible, and devoted sailors and soldiers. By proffering an alternative to U.S. manhood, non-white, rebellious, and extravagant, zoot suiters undermined popular home front values during World War II. According to Mauricio Mazon, the quote, zoot suiters projected a deceptively anarchistic image, essentially nonsensical to adults for aspects of their garb, their clothing, gait, the way they walked, and argot, how they talked. Zoot suiters were nonsensical because, among other things, they took pride in their ambiguity. These aspects of Pachuco culture were, according to Tranquilino and Tag, an assemblage, a cultural affirmation, not by nostalgic return to original wholeness and past, but by appropriation, transgression, and reassemblage, breaking and restructuring the laws of language. Language in the form of speech, but also in the languages of the body, gesture, hair, tattoo, dress, and dance, and in the language of space, the city, the barrio, the street. So the political resonance of the zoot suit opening the show with Wood's performance of Honey is highlighted by Catherine Ramirez's assertion that the zoot suit is both a cultural surface of everyday life and a political statement. Moreover, Ramirez positions the wearing of the zoot suit, especially by women, as an affront to white middle-class notions of gender, sexuality, and mobility. Ramirez continues, quote, the zoot suit was construed as a sign of aberrant femininity, competing masculinity, or homosexuality during the early 1940s. As a non-white, working class, and queer signifier, it was perceived as un-American. Though in the context of the 1940s, the zoot suit served as a political tool, but perhaps was not directly intended as such by those who wore it. As noted by Antonio Viejo, zoot suiters were, quote, able to extract both pleasure from the goods and care for the self, capturing what Foucault in his later work might have called a care for the self. The politics of resistance at hand here is one in which, quote, this is Antonio Viejo again, self-regarding practices of pleasure are revealed when one deigns to care for one's own desprized body, end quote. In the contemporary context, Chavaria's rendition of the zoot suit becomes political, even when one considers that the designer has declared himself a Chicano Ralph Lauren, which translates into Chicano-inspired zoot suit designs, marked by pride and ambiguity and care for the self, becoming quintessential signs of American fashion. I read Chavaria's use of the zoot suit silhouette as less about assimilating it into American or European fashion than it is about highlighting the pleasure of the bachuco, and zoot suiters' historical use of fashion in the service of caring for the self by lending that self the pleasure of indeterminacy. In other words, following Diego, what bachucas or bachucos reveal is a refusal of identity on anyone's terms. It's this refusal, and particularly the fear, dread, and confusion that this refusal unleashes in a multicultural society that contemporary Latino and Chicano identity politics needs to reconsider. The use of the zoot silhouette in Chavaria's oeuvre suggests that there is a politics of refusal within the work that is at play, and this is highlighted in Chavaria's extravagant use of opulently colored and patterned fabrics, adornments such as wide-brimmed hats, rosaries, frills, jewelry, maple flowers, and finally the Jalisco shoe and its heel, which are all luxuriated in. This luxuriation signals the generative possibilities when a subject takes pleasure in endlessly creating themselves. By centering the archetypes of the Pachuco, Campesino, or laborer, and homeboy, Chavaria is changing the appearance of the United States and reworking the nation's conventions of self-fashioning. It is a self-fashioning that leads with more is more, an ethos born out of the figure of the Pachuco zoot suitor, which opens up possibilities for what the other archetypes in the selection might signify. So now I'm going to move on to the middle part of the show, and I want you to see it because it has more Parisian influences, so more European influences in the first part of the show. I'm not going to go into a close reading of this part of the show, but nonetheless, I think that the closing is beautiful, and I'd love for you to see it.
A los negros más te los sacamos a pasear. Los periños por si la gata tienen sed. Hay una de ellas que me acaba de besar. Está cabrón porque ni el nombre me lo sé, yo no sé, a veces quiero regresar al mismo punto donde un día comencé. Está muy rápida la vida, yo me oculto por el día, pero salimos de noche al Bruce Wayne. Los ojos rojos por el haze, botando el humo de la Mary Jane. De día no nos ven, aquí salimos de noche al Bruce Wayne. Los ojos rojos por el haze, botando el humo de la Mary Jane. De día no nos ven, aquí salimos de noche Bruce Wayne, siendo goles Harry Kane. Vicente Fernández, yo me siento un rey. Estos cabrones solo se saben mi name. ¿Qué tú dices? What do you say? Parte piro me quieren bajar del game. Parte babies quieren bajarme Caliplay. Te llegamos con la banda Coldplay. Veamos la de la cabeza Kurt Cobain. En RD yo soy la pan, parece que dijo que yo iba a fracasar, dime dónde andará. Mañana está tirando, pero Dios no me desampara. Está lloviendo dinero y no sé si algún día escampará. Estamos vivos, no hace falta lo que están desde cero. Juro que nada les faltará. La última que tuve le manda el carajo, por el carajo. Aquí todos son reales, los tuyos son máscaras. El carro negro más te lo sacamos a pasear. Los periñón por si las gatas tienen sed. Hay una de ellas que me acaba de besar. Está cabrón porque en el nombre me lo sé, yo no sé, a veces quiero regresar al mismo punto donde un día comencé. Está muy rápida la vida, yo me oculto por el día, pero salimos de noche, Bruce Wayne. Los ojos rojos por el hate, botando el humo de la Mary Jane. Ella nos ve, aquí salimos de noche, Bruce Wayne. Los ojos rojos por el hate, botando el humo de la Mary Jane. Ella no nos ve, aquí salimos de noche, Bruce Wayne.
The middle portion of the show begins with Jay Lutman's performance of his song Bruce Wayne, a song not about the superhero but the everyday man behind the mask, the Batman, wounds and all. Overall, the middle part of the show represents Chavaria's gesture towards Parisian fashion in his designs. According to fashion critics, Chavaria leaned heavily into an idea of neo-Baroque, featuring a 17th century Baroque color palette, bright jewel tones that were manifested as crushed velvets. Other Parisian influences included a black tailored dress and a French-style staple boucle wool collarless jacket with 4 flat pockets adorned with gold buttons. The show also played upon churro oscuro technique of light and dark, exploring the opposing or contradictory themes such as tough and tender, American and European. Tarantula exposes both churro oscuro and depicts the beauty of existence, resistance, and persistence, according to show notes. For the sake of time, I won't go into a reading of one of these outfits from the section of the show. Instead, I'm going to pivot to the third and final part of the show. So I'm going to go ahead and show that last part, and then I'll start wrapping up.
Nunca supondría que usted ya aceptó la misión y el secreto que conlleva. Si le digo de qué se trata, ya no hay vuelta atrás. Oírlo es aceptarlo. Debe saber también que si le digo de qué se trata y entonces acepta considerables sumas de dinero, se transferirán en su Suiza, las Caimán y otros lugares de los que solo usted y yo conocemos la existencia, cifras y códigos, cuentas y millones. Solo usted y yo.
Pues c'est todo. ¿Cuánto más? Aclararé la cabeza. ¿Cuánto tiempo más? Comeré las dos. ¿Cuánto tiempo más? Les daré mi talento. ¿Cuánto tiempo más? Chambearé para nada. Todo, nada, todo, nada, todo, nada. ¿Cuánto tiempo más? A quemar en la cabeza. ¿Cuánto tiempo más?
So the third and final part of the show begins with an aggressive beat, featuring electronic music with a raspy voice narrating lyrics over the track, which then fades to a bass-driven pounding hip-hop beat with a woman's voice repeating todo, 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 nada. The lights turn down and the red lighting is turned up to match the intensity of the music. This section features Chavaria's sportswear collection and his partnership with Adidas, highlighting Chavaria's footwear designs of combat boot-inspired sneakers. The looks are all sports silhouettes marked with Adidas's iconic three-line adornment on sleeves, sides of shorts, and pants. The looks highlight a streetwear influence featuring looks with oversized leather bomber jackets and oversized gym-style shorts, with many models being bare-chested under the garments or with no shirt at all. The models in this section of the show are, quote, Willie's Boys, a group of Latinx men who serve as Chavaria's muses. The concluding looks featuring Willie's Boys, with nothing on their bodies but tattoos and branded boxers peeking out from satin culottes, in contrast to the more choreographed walks of the models wearing high-heeled Jalisco shoes. The models in this section of the show wore the combat boot-inspired sneakers, and one can at once see the gait of the models change to take a more aggressive, less airy, and graceful posture. The garments still move beautifully, which relates to Chavaria's masterful understanding of draping fabrics, but they move with a different swerve. These tough, masculine-looking tattooed but bare-chested guys fall into what Richard T. Rodriguez names as the homeboy aesthetic. According to Rodriguez, the homeboy aesthetic is identifiable as an assemblage of key signifiers: clothing, hair or lack of hair, bold stance, and distinct language. The homeboy aesthetic, to paraphrase John Clark, is more than the simple amalgam of all the separate elements. It derives its specific symbolic quality from the arrangement of all the elements together in one whole ensemble, embodying and expressing the group's self-consciousness, end quote. According to Rodriguez, the homeboy aesthetic is at once the subject of admiration and fear. It is embraced and resisted as a mode of working class sensibility and a marker of cultural difference. While this aesthetic typically signifies heterosexual masculinity, in the show, the homeboy aesthetic is dislodged from the realm of heteronormativity and heterosexuality as the runway becomes the stage where there's an interplay of materiality and fantasy, as Chavaria forces us to consider the chiseled bodies as seemingly part of the garments. The bodies of these men in what style and is what styles the looks. It is the movement of these men and what their bodies do to the clothing that stages the runway as a site of fantasy. The movements of these men, punctuated by their gait, makes the clothing sway, locates movement as a world-making practice. Centering the bodies and the beauty of these men's bodies is a critical part of Willie Chavaria's world. In the show, Chavaria draws our attention to a diverse set of bodily practices enabled by and highlighted by the clothing and how that clothing is styled. It is no secret that designers instruct models how to walk in the garments. However, the diverse bodies we encounter in the show reveal various sites of belonging for the watcher and potential wearer of the garments. The gestures and gait of the models make the models more than just conduits for the clothing. Gestures and corporeal movements reveal much more. Juana Maria Rodriguez's observations about gesture are instructive here. She says, gestures reveal the inscriptions of social and cultural laws, transforming our individual movements into an archive of received these social behaviors and norms that reveal how memory and feeling are enacted and transformed through bodily practices, end quote. Movement and gestures and the examples I have shown you today, racialized masculine gestures become fundamental to understanding the excesses of Chicano fashion. Manuel Cuellar's discussion of movement helped capture what I'm attempting to get at. He writes, gestures possess a formative and transformative quality that is fundamental to the body that performs them. On the one hand, gestures inscribe onto bodies a set of cultural practices that reveal the shared specificities of a given culture. On the other hand, gestures produce kinesthetic sensations that remain in excess of what the gestures themselves might signify or accomplish within that culture. I've suggested that the high heel reshapes or transforms the gait of Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx, Chicana masculinity, and what happens through the mechanics of how the foot is transformed when wearing a heel, which thus transforms the movements and even the gestures of the wearer. which in turn transforms how the person experiences gendered sensations of the body. A swish might appear that was not there. In the case of the combat boot inspired sneaker, a stomp might become more pronounced. The gender gestures associated with masculinity and femininity are necessarily transformed by footwear and garments. What does this mean for Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx, Chicana masculinity? What does it mean that how one stylizes their clothing transforms their gestures and movements? What does it mean that clothing and style might give access to the indulgent gestures and stylized nuances of Chicano masculinity? Wait, before I go back to that video, this is a video that was taken as they were rehearsing, which really shows the indulgent nature of Chicano masculinity that I'm trying to gesture at. So people like before the show, as they are kind of enjoying the garments and also enjoying wearing the shoes, which are the Jalisco shoes. Yeah. So that's enough Chicano indulgence for right now, for the moment. So I'll begin my conclusion with this picture of myself as a child. I grew up in a household where my mother and grandmother were skilled seamstresses. They were so skilled they could whip up a silhouette of your choosing and make it look good based on your particular body type or shape. This outfit is the first outfit I remember designing and styling myself. It is also the only outfit I successfully got my mother to make with a more masculine cut and silhouette. This was before I knew what trans was, but I knew that clothing was one way that I could translate the feelings of masculinity I wanted to embody. Note that the fabric I was able to pick out is a plaid pattern typical in men's suiting. The centerpiece of the outfit being the vest, one part of a three-piece suit, and shorts that were a bit longer than what was a convention for girls at the time. Like Chavaria, I was attracted to the potency of red, wanted to be seen. Finally, the outfit is rounded out with a pin on what I imagine to be my label. The pin is unclear in the picture, but it is a smile now, cry later drama mask pin. One smiling, one crying, much like the tattoo I now bear on my hand. Chicano fashion and style have long been a part of my sense of style and sense of self, and have enabled me to move in the intrinsically gendered ways I long for. Chavaria's show Tarantula brought me to tears due to his use of irreverent Chicano body stylizations to be body armor. Described by Amelia Mesa Baines as, quote, the potentiality in the tilt of the head, the gait, the gesture of the hands, the ultimate body pose, and all its symbolic self-representation, end quote. While at the surface, the hardness of masculinity within Chavaria's styling seems to reify tropes of Chicano masculinity that are heteropatriarchal, sexist, and maybe even machista, but what his use of figures like the pachuco, the campesino, the laborer, the pachuca, and the homeboy, the garments and stylizations of the models unveil a kind of Chicana, Chicano, Chicane, Chicanx style that reveals how Chavaria's use of memory, family storytelling, and the day-to-day practices are ways by which the referential material is codified, retained, fisured, and transfigured in the hands of this designer. Chavaria's work is concerned with transforming American styles that is concerned aesthetically with the everyday reality and historic oppression common in the Americas. This is not more evident in his use of the closed remarks from Bishop Marion Edgar Budd's sermon at the inauguration religious services as the closing audio for his show. As Chavaria and the entire crew of models and performers line up after the last look walks the runway, he proceeds to lead his crew down the runway solemnly as Bishop Budd's plea to President Trump echoes within the church. Her plea is for gay, lesbian, and transgender children and the undocumented workers whose labor is overlooked. Though the speech makes pleas for undocumented workers by explaining that they are, quote, not criminals, pay taxes, and are good neighbors, end quote, a rhetorical tactic that has been criticized for its assimilation of this logic, the fissuring work of Chavaria has been accomplished. He has already shown us the potentialities within his assemblage of disprized bodies that are bathed in the pleasures of negation and indeterminacy, and through gesture and stance emit an impermeable contemporary stoicism common to conditions of survival and endurance within a hostile world. And now I get to say thank you.
So much for the. I have to go back then. Press out for the following pressure. So we're gonna open it up for questions. I asked all my colleagues to ask the question what you all think about it. Thank you so much for these very insightful thoughts being. Thank you for engaging my work as well. So. Yes,
Absolutely. Manuel has invited me to ask the first question.
Yes.
I'm delighted to.
thank you.
Thank you for all the love you showed Manuel.
Yes.
That was delight.
It's
For
important.
all of this campus. Great to see it. Rest there. So Galante, thank you for this presentation. It's lovely. First of all, you showed us a great time. This is like watching that. No one wanted to leave. It was fantastic. It's intellectual. I mean, just two things. One thing I'd love to hear more about what led you to the Jalisco, just personally, what kind of experience led to, that shoot.
Mhm.
And then, in terms of the kind of Chicana studies, I was wondering if you could kind of go back and dwell a little bit more on the, promotional image of that individual, on his hands and knees with the mouth coming to the shoe as a way to approach the, the cultural erotics, a little bit more charge of this commodity and aesthetic object, particularly since you're giving us all of this information about the Zoot suit, the war and the riot. Right, I mean, my imagination takes me to, the policing of Chicana's sexuality, however understood as energy, right?
Mhm.
Pleasure, pain, negative, positive, let's just call it sexual energy.
Mhm.
And I think that image brings us to the present and the represents Trump and the ways that that's trying to eliminate, right, as Explain was saying, including sexual energy. So yeah, the second part of it was if you could talk more about the libidinal and erotics of this as a possibility for kind of Phoenix, but for that, how do you get to the Jalisco?
Yeah, so I got to the Jalisco when it was I follow like a lot of like fashion blogs and things like that, and so I saw that the press release came out for the shoe, and I was interested because it was a partnership with Alan Edmonds, which I understand to be a very more conservative in its look, and historically more conservative in building kind of those traditional like Oxfords, like what you wear. Like I was walking on campus in the morning, and I was like, why is everybody in suits? And then I was like, oh, because they have internships, because it's DC, it does, right? But they're also marked by a very conservative kind of stylization, right? And Alan Edmonds is like the shoemaker, right? Like this is a generational shoe that you buy. Like their narrative is that a father and a son go to pick out their first pair of dress shoes, which is a very class iteration of like fashion and style. And so for Chavaria, as someone who's more concerned with Mexican American style, it was fascinating to me. And then when I saw that it had a heel, it's like, oh, okay, this is where he's really kind of trumping up and really kind of not Trump, but like really kind of like messing with the silhouettes of like traditional conservative like silhouettes of a shoe. And the fact that he goes back into the archives, I tried to get more information for you about the pattern of the shoe, but Edmonds hasn't gotten back to me. But like to know that Chavaria went back historically to find like a silhouette for the shoe that is a shoe that's probably no longer made, right? It's something else to think about, right? Like, is it a shoe that was made in the 40s and the 50s? Or, like what time was that made at was a question that I was thinking about. Because, to go back to that particular time and to add a heel to a conservative pattern of a shoe really kind of does something in relationship to masculinity, right? Like it's bringing the heel back to do something, right? Like I don't necessarily know if it's to heal masculinity, like HEAL, heal masculinity, but it's wanting to enunciate something about masculinity that we are lacking in this particular time, right? And so I think to the libidinal kind of economy that's at play in that, in the promotional ad, right? I think that there's a liberatory impulse there, right? That, you know, all masculine subjects could be more attuned with the libidinal qualities that are present within, like, both like same-sex, not same-sex relationships in terms of sexual, but also same-sex relationships in terms of relationships that are not sexual, right? Like there's a libidinal quality to masculinity that and that arrangement creates that libidinal economy that doesn't necessarily need to lead to sex, but the libidinal energy, right, is what was going on in the 1940s when these young men were taking pleasure and pride in dressing themselves, right? So there's something about like the care of the self that's related to that libidinal quality that's happening in that ad, right? That I think we are asked to think of. So we think of the narrative of masculinity kind of being in crisis in this moment where like feminism is trying to take things away from masculinity. I would say that's not the case. I think masculinity itself is determining what masculinity is in advance, right? So that's not necessarily tapping into libidinal qualities and emancipatory possibilities of masculinity that doesn't have to be sexist, doesn't have to be heteropatriarchal, right? It can be something else if we transform that energy in different types of ways. And I see Chavarria doing that within the garments that he has, right? Like he's wanting to encourage a particular generation to take pride in caring for the self. It doesn't have to mean that you have to buy his clothes, but it has to mean that you are taking care, right? And that's something about masculinity that is often not talked about, right? Like, what does it mean to be emotionally vulnerable, emotionally available? And that can happen through taking care of yourself, through like styling your hair or enjoying what you're wearing or wanting to be seen, right? So thinking about masculinity as not, we're not in a situation where there's a paucity, right, of masculinity. I think we're in a situation where there is a shrinking of masculinity that is happening willfully. And for masculinity not to shrink doesn't mean that it has to be heteropatriarchal or sexist. It means abundance, it means opulence, it means like pride in that without it being at the expense of feminine subjects.
Thank you. And thanks.
Thank you for this really, as I was saying, entertaining, interesting, provocative talk. I feel like I've learned a lot, and my questions reflect how much I've learned, and then I think they're pretty basic, but hopefully generate, right? So I think the first one is about how struck I was by the close readings that you offered with each section of the fashion show. And I noticed that each time you sort of switched to a new section, you began first by speaking about the music, right? Or the lyrics. And one piece of this question is whether you would be willing to share more about what we can glean from maybe the mise-en-scène of the fashion show. So I'm coming to this, I'm like a theater studies person, right? My PhD is in performance studies, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm interested in how you actually think about like assembling the close reading of the fashion show and what's at stake and what you've included and what you've left out. Noticing the various gender presentations of the people involved and the ones that were highlighted and what weren't. I guess I'm asking you, can you like teach me a little bit about how you think about doing that in order to make your point successfully? With emphasis on where we are and what we see there. And then the second question, really simple, maybe not, what does style mean? And I think part of my impetus for raising that is because I think about the care of the self too, and thinking about Foucault talking about the care of the self as something that can produce a certain kind of like aesthetics of existence. And I'm wondering if that's adjacent to style, what is the distinction between style and fashion here? And yeah, and how much are each sort of imbricated with this category of masculinity that we're trying to think through?
Yeah, so I think for the first question on how I get to doing the close readings, I think so one of the things that I left out or didn't have time to talk about is the fact that I touched on the fact that it's in a church, and I explained, why he decides to do it in an Episcopalian church as opposed to a Roman Catholic church because he's Catholic. But he chooses the Episcopalian church because he's so struck by Bishop Budd's speech. But there's also these kind of transfigurative like imagery that he has that are part of the show. Like he has like the t-shirt for the show is Chavaria's face on like Jesus, right? Like on the cross, right? Where he's playing with transfiguration or the process of transfiguration at the religious in the religious sense of like the transfiguration of the body of Jesus, but then we also think of the transfiguration of the bodies in the show and what happens what happens to them within the garments, right? And so like for me thinking about the whole scene is, I have to really kind of try to immerse, or at least what I was trying to do was immerse you into what I understand to be Willy Chavaria's world, right? Which is like this opulence, indulgence, this really kind of feeling of being consumed by what I'm calling or gesturing to as brown abundance, right? Like to read that, I have to go into the individual looks, right? Like I wish I could have given you a reading for every one, but for sake of time I didn't. But there is a way that he's playing with that abundance in every iteration, and it signals something different about the context. So the middle part, which is about Parisian fashion, he's suggesting something about cosmopolitanism, I think, right? And so, and relating to thinking about style and fashion, the differentiation, right? Like fashion with a capital F is like the desire is the kind of staging of the show and the looks in Paris, France, and why that was such a big deal for him, right? Like it's high fashion, it's like he's showcasing his particular style to what is conceived to be kind of the fashion, the like capital or location, right? Like this is where you make your big kind of splash is in Paris Fashion Week, and that's like high fashion. But his high fashion is very much located in the quotidian. It's rooted in labor, right? Like all of his archetypes are about laboring in some kind of a way. For the Bachuco, it's the laboring in leisure, right? Like it's laboring, it's doing the work of doing nothing, which I think is really interesting. And then there's the campesino, right? Which is he's from Fresno, California, the Central Valley. That's about the labor, about the people who work in the fields, right? Or the janitors. If you notice a lot of the accessories were like the keychains, right? Which are, we can think of custodians who carry all their keys, right? So it's very much rooted in labor. And then we have like the homeboy who's the pinto, right? Like who is presumably someone who might have been incarcerated if they have all of those tattoos, right? And that is about like the labor in relationship to that's extracted from people who are incarcerated, right? And so, and he's taking those styles and making them a part of quintessential US style, right? So what does it mean to have a style that's based on various forms of labor, right? Like where style is, we think of fashion as something that's kind of like surface level. And I think style is very much more about the embodiment, right? Like what our bodies bring to the particular garments, how they animate the garments, which is why I was so focused on like giving the reading of like what happens to the foot when it wears the shoe, right? And how it transforms the body, how it transforms the movement of the garment. And that becomes part of style, right? So for a man to wear a heel, right? And the guys that are dancing, right? Like, I think it's great. I think it's amazing that they're dancing and having such a good time, but it's also like an instructive moment for us to see what happens when you have a heel on your shoe, and maybe like your zapateado that you would do when you're drunk is just a little bit better, right? Where you have a little bit of a swish, and that's enjoyable for you for the first time, right? So it's about like how it's pushing at the limits of the body, and in relationship to masculinity, I think there's a way that we think of masculinity as always already having to be accomplished in some kind of a way. And this reveals how masculinity is a little bit unfinished, and how there might be pleasure in encountering that unfinishedness. If that makes sense.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Okay.
So first of all, just thank you for the talk. So I must say, I came to get drained from all the administrative stuff that GW has to, and this has really renewed my spirit. It's really good. Just like Dr. McCaster said, I think I'm being taught this was, as much a lecture as a presentation. I've got 1,000,001 questions, and I've got the privilege of having you at dinner, so I'll save some of them. But I will say, for the audience, please, let's engage. My first question is this, and I had 2 questions, and then your answers were so thick that it sort of modified them. So these questions aren't necessarily fully thought out. But the first question is on this type of concept of Chicano masculinity. And, that means a specific thing within the context and the history, not just of the United States, but the conquering of land that now belongs to the United States. The Chicano versus, Puerto Rican or Dominican. What about Chicano masculinity specifically? Maybe not in opposition, but in contrast to other forms of Latino, Latinx masculinity, either prevents it from being healed, so you need something like fashion to heal it, or sort of allows it to be healed in ways that other forms of Latino, Latinx masculinity do not. So that's sort of the first question. The second question is more about the contemporary, right? We have very few Latino, Latinx professors in the academy, all right? I think the percentage here, Tony, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is well under 3%. What are we as an academy, which you're a part of, doing wrong in talking to Chicana men, whether those be trans or cisgender, and trying to get them on board? We've all seen the numbers. We've seen the slight wave of moves of Latino men towards Trump. Is there something in this work that can tell you, okay, whether you're heterosexual, homosexual, it doesn't matter, the academy should be approaching these young men in a way that respects their masculinity instead of making it problematic? So those are the 2 questions.
Yeah, so I think the first question in terms of thinking comparatively among Latinos and Chicanos, right? I think that the history of this possession really kind of inform how masculinity itself is formed and conceived of. And I think contact, right? The contact between various forms of masculinity, whether it be Puerto Rican or Dominican or Cuban, right, and Mexican. I think that contact, right, provides a way to enrich what masculinity might mean or might do, or what the boundaries are. I mean, I think it doesn't matter necessarily your ethnicity. If you put on that heel, I think that heel is going to be something for you in relationship to your body and how you move. And I think if there's a conversation, or what is the conversation we had about that, right? Or not even conversation, but kind of bodily encounters, the way that the 3 gentlemen are dancing together, where it's unspoken, right? Where it's movements. I think that is liberatory potentiality that we need to unravel and kind of think about. So it's not necessarily, for me, that there's not something unique about Chicano masculinity that enables it, but rather masculinity itself is a facet that lends itself to thinking or wanting us to think more about movement in relationship to masculinity. At least that's what I was continually drawn to, right? What is it about movement? And we can think about this in relationship to diaspora, right? In terms of how you get to the United States, what the history of this possession is, how that affects mobility, literally being able to travel, right? If we translate that into how our bodies are disciplined in particular ways, then that opens up different types of conversations, I think, that comparatively could be really generative, that interest me. And then for the second question, I think part of one of the failures, I think, in terms of how the academy fails masculinity is to really conceive of it as finished and kind of impenetrable. And so I think that there's a way that masculinity is far more porous than we give it credit for. So I think one of the ways that the academy instantiates masculinity as kind of a finished deal, right? Is which is to the detriment of men of color, right? Because men of color specifically, right, are dealing with the unfinishedness of racism, of heteronormativity, of sexism, of empire, right? Empire building, right? I think there's a way that we aren't necessarily having conversations about how masculinity always is translated into an individualistic undertaking, right? As opposed to a collective undertaking. And I don't think the academy has room to conceive of what collectivity might mean, because collectivity means labor organizing, it means like consciousness raising, right? It means like all of the things that the academy doesn't want us to speak to each other about, because once you start talking about inequality, once you start talking about like all the commonalities that you might face as a masculine subject, then and that leads to an incitement, right? Like incitement to advocate for more rights, and incitement to advocate for the whole as a part of as rather than the collective, right? And the academy benefits far more for masculinity being an individualistic kind of endeavor, because it's like that's what masculinity is supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be me over everybody else, right? Like it's supposed to be like my self-interest, as opposed to the interest of the whole, because that's what it means to be masculine, right? To be kind of dominant in some kind of a way is to not be individualistic, but at the same time, masculine folks are also are also subject to the pressures of having to provide, right? So what does that mean? But that means providing just for whoever is closest in your kind of world or realm, right? Which is still segregating us to different types of ways. But that's but
Anyone else?
I just wanted to add one comment. I really appreciate you bringing that up. I think with the academy, to use that term, one of the struggles was also a lot of unlearning as, and also a former GW student. I find a lot of academic conversations around DC. There's a lot of talk around machismo, and this is part of the suite of stereotypes that are imposed from the Anglo lens onto me as a Latino person, to other Latino people, and I struggle to break through conversations with non-Latino colleagues who already come from this mindset of, you're gonna come from a machista lens, and I'm like, you can be a Latino male and also have unpacked and unlearned that. Now you as a non-Latino person have to do the unlearning to not constantly hit me over the head with that expectation that I am automatically a macho operating from a macho lens because I'm a Latino male. So that's just one of those biases that's really hard to break through.
yeah, I would agree, and I think that the dominant kind of conceptions of feminism also invite those types of critiques. And critiquing feminism in as a larger kind of whole for perpetuating kind of that mythos about Latin and Latino masculinity as being always already kind of macho. And like if we look at women of color feminists, right, like there is a way that Black feminists especially, right, we're always conceiving of men as part of who they're advocating for, right? And that's part of the history of feminism that gets like occluded, right? That gets pushed to the side where, men are conceived of as part of who, feminists were advocating for in what a feminist project is. And so there's a lot to blame white mainstream feminism for kind of bringing that lens to put that pressure or that onus on Latino masculine folks to have to undo that work, even if you've unpacked what macho is, right? Like you still have to reckon, like you mentioned, right? Like with those who are imposing those sets of demands and comportments upon you.
Sure. Thank you so much for the lecture. It was fascinating. I'm somebody who comes from Russian studies, and I look at fashion in the post-Soviet context. So the observation that I had was that with the male looks that we looked at, there was this emphatic absence of fit. And one could think, okay, this is oversized, this is global trend, universal trend. But when you look at the female garments, they're very tailored, incredibly fitted, and they're pretty much shaping the body. I'm curious what you make of this emphatic absence of fit in connection to the idea of masculinity, because you talked about how it's unfinished, but it also seems to be somehow not fully fitting some kind of an idea, whether you use that as a potential metaphor, which make fit. It's also interesting to think about how whether you think there is any borrowing that happens between the male and the female wardrobe in the context of your designer. Because on the one hand, it feels like the female looks are kind of something else. They're very different. At the same time, you see with men these tweed jackets that are very Chanel, which is basically like a staple of any female wardrobe. And I'm curious about whether you see your designer playing with our recycling elements coming from the male and female wardrobe.
Yeah, I think for sure to answer that question, like he's definitely borrowing from both, like taking the Chanel, that Chanel jacket, the collarless jacket with like the gold buttons, right, and making it into like a quote unquote male garment. But what's interesting about Chavaria to me is that he's emphatically says that his clothes are genderless, right? But like, I mean, he's still not quite there with the sizing, right? Like the sizing is not like you can't, if you're a woman, you can't get the shoe that I talked about, right? Like they don't make it at a small size yet. But the question about the fit, I think is really interesting, and I hadn't thought about because there is something about there not being a fit for the men's clothing that is so large. It's I don't think it's about the trend, like you mentioned. I don't think it's like about it being a global trend. I think he is playing with the drape of the clothing that is gesturing back to the butchucos and being and wanting to create a silhouette that is enveloping of the subject. I think really purposefully to envelop and to create this luxuriating kind of experience or aesthetic that suggests something about masculinity, that it needs to be cared for in a particular way. And I think for the feminine subjects, I think that women and feminine subjects, like, not to say they don't need to be cared for, but I think there's a way that femininity itself, right, like announces and has enunciated itself in different types of ways that Chavaria is indexing a particular history of these women, these pachucas, right, who were taking from men's silhouettes, right, making them close to the body, translating them in the ways that they needed to out of necessity, right? So I'm saying that women don't need that care that men need in some ways, not necessarily because they're not worthy of it, but I think there's something that he's suggesting about the fragility of masculinity in some ways too. But I think in terms of the women's garments, I think he's definitely also really gesturing like mid-century, the new look, Yves Saint Laurent. I think that's kind of also was part of his desire to show the French, right? Like I know your looks, I know your aesthetics, so I'm gonna translate these very quintessential mid-century French looks into what Mexican Americanized version of it might be. I think that he's new with women's clothing and women's silhouettes, so I think they're not as like their stamp or their impact is not as punctuated as like the masculine silhouettes for sure. But I really appreciate your noticing of like the form and like the fit, because that really makes me think a little bit about what I'm trying to do. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Yes, so thank you so much for giving this fantastic presentation on the designer. And my question for you is, so how do you consider, you talk about the gender dynamic, so how do you consider the future evolution of this gender dynamic because of the way, and I ask this because of the way in which you divide the show. You divide it into three main parts. In the first section, you focus on the zoot shoot. In addition to the zoot shoot making an appearance, you also notice, for example, on the very first model that's wearing the red suit, they have the rosary right where the nasal is. You have the opera singer singing her name. And in a way, it makes me think of the way that these archetypes were created, because you go back to 1940s into the history of these looks. And then you divide the second part into the European looks, as you claim them. You have the Chanel look with the full pocket jacket. And in addition to that, you also bring back the archetype of the working man, for example, with the keys on the pants. The third section, you divide it into, I would more so consider it to be a de-assimilationist stance, due to the fact that the models are practically wearing nothing with the exception of their underwear and their pants. You have the tattoos, you focus on the swagger of the man. So you see these models deconstructing the assimilated European archetype. So what's after this de-assimilation process? How do you consider the future of male design? And where do you think it will go?
I mean, I think I see it in line with, I quoted Antonio Vego at length where he's interested in kind of a non-identitarian politics. And so I see that, not that Chavarria will give up his kind of Mexican-American influence stylizations, right? But we'll focus more so on like what the body is doing with the garments, like what we begin to see here, which is I think a big difference between his early clothes, which were more concerned with like overt political statements, like his last show had like sweaters with like the UFW, the United Farm Workers, kind of on it. He still does a little bit of it with his partnership with HRC, which I don't really love too much, and I didn't talk too much because I didn't want to be a downer, but like I see I see him kind of moving towards, or the future being in this non-identitarian kind of strand, which is more concerned with object and feeling installation, right? As opposed to being more concerned with like a politics based purely on the essentialist kind of understandings of an ethnic identity or something like that, right? So for me, it becomes more about sensation and the movement and what he can do with the body. And if he's really truly interested in kind of a genderless line, right, then it has to be about what the body does, right? It's completely about what different gender bodies do to the garments, right? And how he can use the garments to have the body be that conduit with gesture, with pose, with the gait, with even I would say with the look, like giving face also too, which I didn't talk too much about, but that's also a really commonly written thing about in Chicano photography, which is kind of giving face, like a stoic kind of face, which we see in a lot of the models, right? So I think like him being more fascinated with the body, what the body can do to the garments, as opposed to the garments doing like the political work. That makes sense.
Yeah, so do you think that because of that, that clothing is only going to get only more flowy or more baggy from here? Because like with the woman, female silhouettes, as another member mentioned, they're very tailored.
Mhm.
Meanwhile, for the men, it's very loose, very flowy. So do you think that in the female domain that there'll be more accentuation
Yeah,
of
I
this
think so.
flowiness, vastness, because it seems like sometimes when the clothing is very oversized and it's flowy, that's what allows the waves.
Mhm.
In the clothes, you can capture the movements.
Yeah, I think so too, and we get to see it, I think, a little bit in this look, right, because this is Becky G, and she's wearing like, she has a shawl, right, that's kind of like at the ends, right, like it's not necessarily fitted and it's kind of moving behind her. So I think like he's getting there, but I think perhaps he still has more to learn about the female form that he wants to explore, or maybe he's like also privileges masculinity in some kind of a way. I'd love to talk to him about it. That would be like the dream, right? To talk to Willie Chavarria about like how he's understanding the female body as opposed to the male body, or if there's even a conception, even if there's even a difference for him. But clearly there is, because he's making the choice to have the women's silhouettes be far more tailored than the men's. So he's definitely, being a little bit more, I would say, offering more liberatory possibilities for masculinity in some sense, as opposed to femininity. And that's, I think, the characteristic.
Okay, who wants to ask the last question so that we give a break to our speaker? Victoria, go ahead.
This might be a bit of an obvious question. I history, so I apologize, I am completely out of my depth here.
Okay.
But where do you see the Paris fashion show going from here on, now that Chavarria has presented his work? Is he part of a longer trajectory of Chicane, Latine, fashion designers that have started to bring it into the industry? Or is he one of a kind, a first that's going to be a trailblazer?
I think he eventually is gonna be like the vice president or like vice president of design for like a French fashion house. That's what I foresee for him. Like, I think that's what most people are kind of like predicting, that eventually he will be like the director, the vice president of like Saint Laurent or one of the French fashion houses, which will put his style on a global stage. I initially found it really interesting because he said that he was the, Chicano Ralph Lauren, and Ralph Lauren is so quintessentially like American and Americana. So I would love to see him transform what Americana is. I don't think he's quite done it yet, but I think for me selfishly, I'd like for him to continue to transform what defines or is definitive of American culture, because it would dislodge it from institutions that are insanely racist and sexist, right? Like thinking about, like, I love Ivy fashion, like I love the way it looks, but it's also rooted in a particular history of the Ivy Leagues, right? Which is rooted in like extracting economies that are rooted in slavery, right? Like these institutions, like where stakeholders like have yet to make reparations for that, and fashion, and there's a whole style that's built on the reputation or like the aesthetics of like Ivy fashion. And so to think of a Chicano fashion designer, if he could dislodge what that might mean, so Americana becomes replaced with something else that is a more resistant kind of look, that would be my dream. But I think he's gonna end up being at a French fashion house, which is fine too. He can take on the world.
So you want to ask me?
I wanted to like, I don't know, ask a follow-up question to your answer and to her question. So like, I was thinking about like, you saying like foreseeing the designer becoming like a vice president of the French fashion house. Seeing that like this aesthetic is like rooted in like brown and black bodies, experiences, and aesthetics, what would that do if that like adds to the aesthetic of whiteness? A lot of this like, I don't know, should we be like fearful of that? Like, I feel like this experience in this fashion show is like adding to that collective, like making, and I'm saying this for like people of color. Am I like finally being able to like see your aesthetics and like understand it? And then for that to then become a part of like, I don't know, I feel like a lot of like French fashion houses are centered around whiteness. Like, yes, now you can say like not entirely, like the customers are all white, but it's always centered around whiteness. And for something that kind of is like beautiful and revolutionary and like healing for Black and brown bodies to then just become another like aesthetic for the white curiosity, I don't know, is that something we should be fearful of or counter?
I think so. I think being suspicious of it for sure is a good instinct to have. Like part of what he did for Fashion Week is that he rode around Paris in a lowrider, right? And so like that becomes a fascination, right, for Parisians. But conversely, what might it mean? It might, his looks, right, and it rooted in the particular histories might force like European nations who aren't actively confronting like racist hierarchies within their societies to kind of come face to face with that, right? Like I think that people will say that in Europe there's a conception in the United States that we are just so retrograde, right, in how racist we are, right? Whereas European countries themselves aren't necessarily confronting the hierarchies around race or what those histories are. So I think like, the utopianist and the kind of utopianist in me, right, and the desire to see something good happen would be that he would force those conversations and imbricate himself, involve himself in a kind of larger geopolitical conversation about race and even migration is very important. And bring that to a global stage. But I do think we have to be careful with like the possible fetishization of Chicano Mexican American Latin culture that could happen, right? And putting, like, we don't want another Gwen Stefani, right? We don't want another Gwen Stefani moment. We want the silhouettes to have a lasting impact and a lasting stamp on what constitutes like men's wear, right, or women's wear. And it to be rooted in a particular history of resistance, I think is meaningful and gives people an opportunity to style their looks. Even if you can't afford a Willie Chavaria, you can certainly style yourself in relationship to the silhouettes and kind of the looks that he's creating that could be liberatory.
Well, here for that, please join me one. Thanks to him for a great statement.